Sometimes a take is so wild that it forces everyone to stop and ask a simple question. What are we really doing here? Because this time, it wasn't about a fringe player. It wasn't about a contract dispute. It wasn't even about a disappointing season. This time, the noise was aimed straight at the heart of the Cleveland Browns defense, and the name at the center of the storm was Myles Garrett. In the middle of what should have been a moment of reflection for the Browns, after a season filled with chaos, injuries, and organizational reset, one voice decided to light a match. Lloyd publicly suggested that the Browns should trade Myles Garrett, not rebuild around him, not maximize his prime, trade him. After one of the most dominant defensive seasons the league has seen in years. And that's when the conversation stopped being about football and started becoming something much bigger. Because let's be clear, this wasn't a mild opinion. This wasn't a what-if discussed quietly in an off-season meeting room. This was a loud, confident declaration that the Browns should move on from a generational talent in his prime, all in the name of draft capital and vague future potential. And almost instantly, fans felt it. Something about this didn't sit right. What made it even more explosive was the timing. The Browns were struggling, yes. The coaching staff had just been shaken up. The franchise was searching for direction. And through all of that instability, one constant remained. Myles Garrett showed up every week against double teams, against game plans built entirely to stop him. He didn't disappear, he didn't coast, he dominated, and yet somehow he became the problem. That's when people started connecting dots, because this wasn't the first time Lloyd aimed his fire at a cornerstone player. Not long before this, Shedeur Sanders found himself on the receiving end of similar criticism. Different position, same tone, same dismissal, same pattern, and once fans noticed it, they couldn't unsee it. Now the debate isn't just about whether trading Myles Garrett makes football sense. It's about credibility, motive, and whether certain narratives are being pushed for attention rather than truth. Because when analysis ignores production, leadership, and impact, and replaces them with hot takes designed to provoke outrage, something gone wrong. So the real question is whether the Browns should trade Myles Garrett. The real question is why anyone would seriously suggest it, and what that says about the state of sports media today. Let's slow this down and actually examine what Lloyd said, because the more you unpack it, the more unbelievable it becomes. His argument wasn't subtle. He openly pushed the idea that the Browns should trade Myles Garrett now, while his value is high, collect draft picks, and reset the roster. On paper, that might sound like a strategy teams use during full rebuilds. But here, the problem. Cleveland isn't talking about rebuilding from scratch, and Myles Garrett isn't a declining asset. He's the engine of the defense. This wasn't a season where Garrett padded stats against bad teams or disappeared in big moments. This was a year where offenses structured entire game plans around avoiding him. Chips, double teams, slide protections, quick throws, none of it stopped him. And despite all of that, he still led the league in sacks, pressures, and quarterback hits. That's not normal production. That's dominance. So when Lloyd suggested the Browns could find better players at Garrett's position through the draft, it crossed from debate into absurdity. Better than who, exactly? The best edge defender in football. The guy offensive coordinators lose sleep over. That's not analysis. That's provocation. And then came the second layer of the take, the idea that Garrett isn't a big game player. That's where fans really snapped, because it directly contradicts years of tape. Garrett has closed games. He's forced turnovers at critical moments. He's wrecked playoff-bound teams. The notion that he somehow fades when it matters isn't supported by numbers, film, or reality. What makes this even more confusing is the context. The Browns' struggles this season weren't because the defense failed. They were because of instability everywhere else. Coaching turnover, offensive inconsistency, quarterback uncertainty. And through all of that, Garrett remained the one unit you could rely on. He didn't point fingers. He didn't demand trades. He didn't coast. He produced. That's why this take felt less like a genuine football argument and more like content designed to spark outrage. Because when a journalist ignores context, dismisses elite production, and frames a franchise cornerstone as expendable, people are going to ask why. And once that question is asked, it doesn't stop at football logic. It starts digging into patterns, motives, and whether this is really about team building or about staying relevant by saying the loudest thing possible. And that's where the conversation starts getting uncomfortable. This is where the conversation shifts from one bad take to something bigger. Because if this were just a one-off moment, fans might roll their eyes and move on. But Jason Lloyd's comments didn't exist in a vacuum. They landed on top of a growing list of controversial stances that all seemed to follow the same direction. And once people noticed that pattern, it became impossible to ignore. Start with the quarterbacks. Lloyd was outspoken about Shedeur Sanders not belonging on the Browns roster, questioning his value, upside, and even his presence. That alone stirred debate because Sanders hadn't even been given a fair runway yet. But then compare that tone with how Lloyd discussed Dillon Gabriel. Suddenly, the language softened. The expectations lowered. The patience increased. Gabriel didn't have to be great. He just had to be competent. That contrast didn't sit right with a lot of fans. Now fast forward to Myles Garrett, a proven superstar, a former Defensive Player of the Year, a guy who just delivered a historic season while everything around him collapsed. And Lloyd's solution: trade him, cash out, move on, not because Garrett demanded it, not because his play declined, but because Lloyd believes the Browns should settle for 8 or 9 wins and reset. That's when people stopped arguing football and started questioning intent. Because criticism is part of sports media. No player is above scrutiny. But when the harshest critiques consistently land on the same types of players, especially when their on-field performance doesn't justify it, fans are going to connect dots. Whether Lloyd intended it or not, the optics became impossible to defend. The pushback wasn't just emotional, it was logical. Ask yourself this: if Garrett had the exact same numbers, the same impact, the same consistency, but fit a different media archetype, would this conversation even exist? Would anyone seriously float the idea of trading a league-leading, prime-aged edge rusher who anchors an entire defense? That's why the reaction escalated so quickly. Fans weren't just defending Garrett. They were defending the idea that elite performance should still matter more than narratives, that production should outweigh provocation, and that journalists should be held accountable when their takes consistently clash with reality. Lloyd's defenders say he's just asking tough questions. But tough questions require solid premises. And the premise that the Browns are better off without Myles Garrett collapses the moment you turn on the tape. At some point, repeated controversy stops being coincidence. It becomes a brand. And once a media figure's brand becomes outrage over objectivity, their credibility is what takes the real hit. And that brings us to the most damning part of all: what Garrett actually did this season, and why ignoring it makes the argument completely indefensible. If Jason Lloyd's argument had even a shred of statistical backing, this conversation might still be happening on neutral ground. But that's the problem. Once you dig into what Myles Garrett actually did on the field, the entire idea of trading him collapses instantly. This isn't about opinions anymore. It's about facts. The Browns' 2024-2025 season was chaos. Coaching changes, offensive inconsistency, injuries, instability everywhere you looked. And yet in the middle of all of that, Garrett didn't just play well, he dominated. He led the entire NFL in sacks, not tied, not top 5, number 1. That alone should end the debate. But it gets worse for Lloyd's case. Garrett wasn't padding stats in meaningless games. He was wrecking game plans. Offensive coordinators built entire protection schemes just to slow him down, and most of them failed. Double teams didn't work. Chips didn't work. Quick passes didn't work. He still got home. Quarterbacks felt him before the snap and panicked after it. Then there was the 7-sack game. 7. In one game, that's not just rare, that's historic. Most elite pass rushers dream of a 3-sack night once a season. Garrett doubled that and then some. Performances like that don't just win games, they define eras. And it wasn't only pass rushing. Garrett was elite against the run, setting the edge and blowing up plays before they developed. He finished near the top of the league in pressures, quarterback hits, and win rate. Pro Football Focus graded him as the best edge defender in football, and it wasn't a close race. This is where the trade him logic completely unravels. You don't trade generational players in their prime unless one of three things is true: they're declining, they're demanding out, or your team is rebuilding from the ground up with no timeline. None of those apply here. Garrett is still improving. He hasn't asked out, and the Browns are very clearly trying to compete now. Draft picks don't replace players like Myles Garrett. They hope to become players like him. That distinction matters. A first-round pick might turn into a good starter. A second-round pick might become rotational depth. Garrett is already the outcome teams pray for when they draft edge rushers. So when Lloyd argues that the Browns could find better players at Garrett's position through picks, it doesn't sound bold. It sounds disconnected from reality. This is why fans reacted so strongly. Not because Garrett is untouchable, but because the argument ignores everything football actually values: production, consistency, impact, and availability. And once those facts are on the table, the conversation stops being about strategy and starts being about why someone would push a narrative that clearly doesn't match the evidence. This is the moment where the conversation shifts from football into something far more uncomfortable. Because when you line up Jason Lloyd's recent takes side by side, a pattern starts to emerge that fans can't unsee. And once you notice it, it's impossible to ignore. This didn't start with Myles Garrett. Before Lloyd ever floated the idea of trading a generational defensive player, he had already spent months questioning why Shador Sanders should even be on the Browns roster. Not questioning fit, not questioning development timeline, questioning his presence altogether. A young quarterback with proven efficiency, leadership traits, and upside, written off before he was ever given real opportunity. Then look at who Lloyd does praise. Dillon Gabriel, a quarterback he openly described as competent. Not elite, not special, just competent, yet somehow worthy of patience, opportunity, and benefit of the doubt. No trade talk. No "what are we doing here" energy, just calm reassurance. That contrast is where the tension lives. Garrett dominates at an MVP level. Trade him. Sanders shows promise. He shouldn't be here. Gabriel looks average. Let's see what happens. Individually, each take could be dismissed as opinion. Together, they form something else. A repeated willingness to undermine elite black players while extending grace to others with lesser resumes. That's why fans aren't just angry anymore. They're suspicious. And it's not just fans. Former players, analysts, and even media peers have started calling out how these narratives are framed. Garrett isn't criticized for technique. He's questioned for big game impact, despite overwhelming evidence. Sanders isn't evaluated on tape. He's reduced to interview rumors and personality labels. The conversation keeps drifting away from football whenever it involves them. That's the issue. When analysis consistently shifts from performance to perception, from results to vibes, it stops being objective. And when that shift only seems to happen to certain players, people are going to ask why. This doesn't mean every critique is rooted in bias, but it does mean repeated framing choices matter. Journalism isn't just about what you say. It's about what you emphasize, what you minimize, and who you're willing to tear down for attention. Because let's be honest, these takes generate clicks, they spark outrage, they create viral debates. Lloyd knows that, and controversy has clearly become his lane. The problem is credibility doesn't survive that strategy forever. When fans feel like narratives are being manufactured instead of earned, trust erodes fast. And once that happens, every future take gets questioned, even the fair ones. This is why the Garrett situation feels bigger than one bad opinion. It feels like the latest example in a trend that people are finally willing to call out. And once that door opens, it doesn't close quietly. Now let's bring this conversation back to where it was supposed to start in the first place, the football. Because once you strip away the noise, the speculation, and the hot take theater, Jason Lloyd's argument collapses under its own weight. If you are genuinely talking about improving a football team, trading Myles Garrett makes no sense. None. Zero. This isn't a solid starter you're trying to flip before decline. This isn't a good but replaceable piece. This is a generational edge rusher in his prime, producing at a level most teams spend decades trying to find. 7 sacks in one game. That alone should end the conversation. But it doesn't stop there. Garrett didn't just lead the league in sacks during a chaotic Browns season. He did it while offenses schemed entire game plans around avoiding him. Double teams, chips, slide protections, quick throws designed purely to neutralize his presence, and even then he still wrecked games. That's not a player you replace with draft picks. That's the player draft picks are hopping to become. The idea that you trade a proven defensive superstar to find better players at his position is the kind of logic that only works on paper in fantasy football forums. In the real NFL, edge rushers of this caliber don't just grow on trees. You don't trade certainty for lottery tickets unless you're rebuilding from the ground up. And here's the part Lloyd never fully addresses. The Browns are not rebuilding. They aren't tanking. They aren't resetting. They aren't tearing it down. They are trying to stabilize chaos. In moments like that, you build around your pillars. You don't ship them out. Garrett isn't just production. He's leadership. He's accountability. He's the one player on that defense opponents fear every single snap. Remove him and everything else collapses. Coverage gets exposed. Young defenders lose protection. The margin for error disappears. And yet Lloyd frames this as a forward-thinking move. It's not forward-thinking, it's destructive. What makes this worse is the timing. Garrett just delivered arguably the best season of his career in the middle of organizational dysfunction, coaching changes, scheme uncertainty, offensive inconsistency, and still, he showed up every week and dominated. That's the exact type of player franchises hold onto at all costs. So when someone argues that this is the guy you move on from, fans aren't wrong to ask what's really driving the take. Because the football argument doesn't support it. The roster-building logic doesn't support it. The competitive timeline doesn't support it. Which leaves only one explanation. This wasn't about strategy. It was about stirring the pot. And once you realize that, everything else suddenly makes a lot more sense. This is the point where fans stop rolling their eyes and start paying closer attention. Because if Jason Lloyd's Myles Garrett take existed in a vacuum, it would just be another bad opinion in a crowded media landscape. But it doesn't exist in isolation. It fits a pattern, and that pattern is what's making people uncomfortable. Start connecting the dots. First, it was Shador Sanders, a young quarterback prospect with clear upside, strong college production, and growing league intrigue. Lloyd dismissed him almost immediately, framing him as unnecessary, overhyped, and not worth roster consideration. No patience, no nuance, no acknowledgement of development. Then it shifted to Myles Garrett, a proven, dominant, in-his-prime superstar. Suddenly, Lloyd's tone wasn't just skeptical, it was dismissive, suggesting Garrett isn't a big-game player, questioning his impact when it matters most, and floating the idea that the Browns would somehow be better off without him. Meanwhile, notice who doesn't receive that same energy. Lloyd had no problem publicly backing Dillon Gabriel, praising his potential, and calling him competent before he'd even taken an NFL snap. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans started asking a simple question: why do some players get grace while others get constant skepticism? This is where the conversation gets sensitive, but it can't be avoided. When criticism consistently targets elite black athletes while comparable or less proven players receive softer treatment, people are going to question intent. Not because they want controversy, but because the trend is too consistent to ignore. And before anyone jumps to extremes, this isn't about saying journalists can't criticize players. They absolutely can. But criticism should be rooted in performance, context, and fairness. When those pillars disappear, credibility goes with them. Lloyd's language matters here. He didn't say, let's explore roster flexibility. He didn't say, this might be an option if the team fully rebuilds. He went straight to absolutes: trade him, move on, replace him. That kind of framing isn't analysis, it's provocation. And provocation gets clicks. The problem is, when provocation becomes your brand, you stop informing fans and start manipulating narratives. You stop discussing football and start manufacturing controversy. And once that line is crossed, every take gets viewed through a different lens. That's why people aren't just debating Lloyd's opinions anymore. They're questioning his motives. Is this about honest evaluation? Or is it about staying relevant in an attention economy where outrage travels faster than logic? Because when takes consistently punch down at proven excellence, fans stop seeing a journalist. They start seeing an agenda. And that's a dangerous place for any media figure to land. Strip away the noise, the outrage, the hot takes, and the clickbait framing, and you're left with one unavoidable truth. Trading Myles Garrett would be organizational malpractice. Not bold strategy, not forward thinking, malpractice. Let's talk football reality. The Cleveland Browns do not have a surplus of elite talent. They have very few true game wreckers, players who force opposing offenses to change protection schemes, game plans, and play calling before the ball is even snapped. Myles Garrett is one of those players. In fact, he's one of the very few defenders in the entire league who belongs in that category. You don't replace that with draft picks. You pray draft picks turn into that. Jason Lloyd's argument hinges on the idea that the Browns could find better players at Garrett's position through the draft. That's fantasy football logic, not NFL reality. For every elite edge rusher taken in the first round, there are dozens who never reach Garrett's level, if they even become starters at all. And timing matters. Garrett isn't declining. He isn't injured beyond repair. He isn't coasting on reputation. He just finished a season where he led the league in sacks, pressures, and quarterback hits. He recorded one of the most dominant single-game performances in modern NFL history. That's not a player you move away from. That's a player you build around. The Browns' real problem isn't Myles Garrett, it's instability. Coaching turnover, quarterback uncertainty, front office indecision. Those are the issues holding Cleveland back. Not a generational edge rusher doing exactly what he's paid to do every Sunday. Trading Garrett doesn't fix any of that. It amplifies it. You trade him, and suddenly your defense loses its identity. Your locker room loses its leader. Your fan base loses trust. And your young players lose the one guy who sets the standard for preparation, effort, and accountability. Even from a business perspective, it's nonsensical. Garrett is a face of the franchise star. He sells jerseys. He sells tickets. He gives Cleveland national relevance. Removing him doesn't reset the timeline, it sets it back years. And here's the most important part that gets ignored in all this noise. Elite players don't grow on trees, especially ones who want to stay in Cleveland, embrace the city, and represent the organization the right way. When you find one, you don't run him out of town. You protect him. The idea that the Browns would be healthier without Myles Garrett isn't just wrong, it's upside down. And the fact that this take is even being floated tells you how disconnected some media narratives have become from actual football logic. When you step back and look at the full picture, this situation stops being about football opinions and starts being about credibility. Jason Lloyd's push to trade Myles Garrett isn't grounded in roster building, analytics, or long-term vision. It's rooted in provocation, and that's why it's resonating the wrong way with so many fans. Myles Garrett isn't a problem to solve. He's the solution most franchises spend decades searching for: a homegrown, generational talent, a leader who produces even when the organization around him is unstable, a player who never hides, never deflects, and never disappears when the lights are brightest. Those players are supposed to be protected, not packaged into trade hypotheticals for clicks. And that's what makes this conversation dangerous. When media narratives drift too far from reality, they don't just confuse fans, they actively damage trust. They blur the line between analysis and agenda. Whether Lloyd's motivation is attention, controversy, or something deeper, the result is the same: a take that collapses under basic scrutiny. The Browns' future will not be determined by whether they trade Myles Garrett. It will be determined by whether they can finally build stability around elite talent instead of constantly tearing it down. Championship teams don't cycle out their best players. They elevate everything around them. Garrett's legacy in Cleveland isn't up for debate. His production isn't theoretical. His impact isn't exaggerated. The only thing being exposed here is how far some voices are willing to stretch logic to stay relevant. And Browns fans see it. The league sees it. The tape sees it. Myles Garrett isn't going anywhere, but the credibility of takes like this, that's already slipping fast.